September 8, 1941, Leningrad, Soviet Union. In a city where families boiled leather belts and wallpaper glue just to stay alive, something impossible was about to happen. Over 2.5 million people trapped behind enemy lines, starving to death as German artillery pounded their streets day and night. Children collapsed in classrooms from hunger. Adults queued for bread rations that shrank to mere crumbs. The Nazi plan was simple: let starvation do what bullets couldn't. But 5,000 miles away, in Detroit factories and American shipyards, democracy's greatest weapon was awakening, not tanks or bombs, but something far more devastating. Assembly lines that never stopped, Liberty ships sliding into icy waters, their hulls packed with hope. Because while Hitler counted on hunger to break the human spirit, he never calculated what would happen when American industrial might collided with Soviet determination. How do you starve a city that's being fed by the world's most powerful democracy? What happens when freedom's factories become deadlier than any Wehrmacht division? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The autumn air in Leningrad carried the acrid smell of burning buildings and the sharper scent of fear. Anna Zhdanova pulled her threadbare coat tighter as she hurried past the rubble of what had been the Nevsky Prospect's finest shops. Artillery shells thundered in the distance, each explosion sending tremors through the frozen ground beneath her worn boots. The queue for bread stretched 4 city blocks, a serpentine line of hollow-eyed civilians clutching ration cards like sacred relics. Inside her coat pocket, Anna's fingers traced the edges of her diary, its pages chronicling a descent into hell that began 3 weeks earlier when the last road out of Leningrad had been severed. The German Army Group North, commanded by Field Marshal Wilhelm Ritter von Leeb, had completed their encirclement with methodical precision. No roads in, no roads out. Over 2.5 million civilians trapped like insects in amber. The bread ration had dropped to 400 grams per day for workers, 200 for everyone else. But even those meager portions were theoretical. The dark, dense loaves contained more sawdust and cellulose than wheat. Anna watched a child ahead of her in line sway on unsteady legs, his mother's arms barely strong enough to hold him upright. In her classroom the previous morning, 3 students had collapsed during lessons, their small bodies succumbing to hunger that gnawed relentlessly at their insides. She opened her diary and wrote with a pencil stub, "We live on paper, not food." The children's eyes have grown too large for their faces. Today, little Pavel asked if we could eat the chalk. I had no answer. The bombardment intensified as German 150mm howitzers found their range. Each shell that screamed overhead represented Field Marshal von Leeb's strategy of calculated cruelty. Why waste German lives storming the city when winter and starvation would accomplish the same goal? His headquarters buzzed with reports, enemy morale cracking, civilian deaths mounting, resistance weakening. The mathematics of siege warfare favored patience. But von Leeb's calculations failed to account for the industrial miracle awakening across the Atlantic Ocean. In Washington, Harry Hopkins moved through the corridors of power with urgent determination. The Lend-Lease Act had passed Congress, and America's factories were beginning their transformation from peacetime production to the arsenal of democracy. Liberty ships were sliding down the ways at unprecedented speed, their holds destined to carry not just weapons, but hope itself across 5,000 miles of treacherous ocean. Anna tore a strip of wallpaper from her kitchen wall that evening, examining the paste beneath with the calculating eyes of the starving. Soon that glue might be their only source of sustenance. She stared at her pale children huddled around a dying fire fed by furniture legs and picture frames. The siege was more than military strategy. It was a test of human will against the machinery of extinction. Field Marshal Wilhelm Ritter von Leeb spread the tactical maps across his oak desk, each line and symbol representing the methodical strangulation of a great city. Outside his headquarters, German soldiers shuffled through the Baltic cold, their winter uniforms inadequate for the Russian climate that bit through wool and leather with merciless efficiency. The irony was not lost on von Leeb. His forces suffered from the same supply shortages that were supposed to break Soviet resistance. "Shells are expensive," von Lieb explained to his assembled generals, his breath visible in the unheated room. "Every artillery round we fire costs the Reich precious resources that could be better used elsewhere. Hunger will accomplish what high explosives cannot." His strategy was elegant in its cruelty: encircle Leningrad completely, preventing any supplies from reaching the trapped population, and wait for starvation to force surrender. Hitler's directive had been explicit: Leningrad must vanish from the face of the earth. But von Lieb advocated a more efficient approach. The city contained over 700,000 tons of food when the siege began, enough to feed 2.5 million people for perhaps 2 months at normal consumption. Mathematical certainty favored the Wehrmacht. Time was their ally, winter their weapon, and hunger their most reliable soldier. The Army Group North commanded 725,000 men, but von Lieb knew his limitations. Fuel deliveries had been reduced by 40% to support the drives on Moscow and Kiev. Artillery ammunition was rationed, with daily allocations barely sufficient to maintain psychological pressure on the defenders. A direct assault would cost tens of thousands of German lives and consume resources the Reich could not spare. Instead, von Lieb orchestrated a symphony of systematic deprivation. His artillery targeted food distribution centers, power plants, and transportation networks. Each successful strike deepened the city's isolation, accelerating the mathematics of mass starvation. Reports from forward observers described crowds fighting over scraps of bread, families burning furniture for warmth, children too weak to attend school. The German soldiers implementing this strategy understood its effectiveness, even as they suffered its consequences. Their own rations had been reduced: black bread, watery soup, and occasional portions of horse meat, when supply convoys managed to navigate the increasingly dangerous roads. Many Wehrmacht units were consuming fewer calories than the Leningrad civilians they were besieging. Von Lieb studied intelligence reports with grim satisfaction. Civilian deaths were climbing, first hundreds daily, then thousands. The city's medical system was collapsing under the weight of starvation-related diseases. Soviet military units showed signs of declining combat effectiveness as hunger weakened their ability to man defensive positions. What von Lieb could not see from his maps and statistics was the parallel mobilization occurring across the Atlantic. While his forces tightened their grip on Leningrad, American shipyards were accelerating production schedules that would have seemed impossible months earlier. Every day, new Liberty ships slid into the water, their construction times dropping from 244 days to 42 days as American industrial efficiency reached wartime tempo. The field marshal stared across the frozen expanse of Lake Ladoga, confident that nature and hunger would achieve victory without the massive casualties of urban warfare. His calculations were precise, his strategy sound, his execution methodical. But von Lieb had not factored American industrial capacity into his equations, a variable that would soon render his careful mathematics obsolete. The corridors of the White House hummed with an energy that Harry Hopkins had never experienced. In 2 decades of government service, typewriters clattered in offices that never seemed to close, clerks processed mountains of paperwork, and urgent telephone calls connected Washington to shipyards, factories, and military installations across the continent. The Lend-Lease Act had transformed America's industrial capacity into a weapon as potent as any bomb or battleship. Hopkins carried a thick folder containing desperate requests from the Kremlin: trucks, aircraft, weapons, and most critically, food. Stalin's cables painted a stark picture of Soviet resistance hanging by the thinnest threads, with Leningrad serving as the most visible symbol of Nazi ruthlessness. Every day the city held meant thousands more civilian deaths, but every day it held also tied down German divisions that could otherwise be deployed against Moscow or in North Africa. Skeptics in Congress questioned the wisdom of feeding a foreign nation while Americans faced their own rationing and shortages. Why should Detroit auto workers sacrifice overtime pay to build trucks for Russians they would never meet? Hopkins answered such concerns with a simple calculation. Soviet survival was American victory. Every German division besieging Leningrad was a division not attacking British convoys or reinforcing Rommel in Libya. The industrial transformation was staggering in its scope and speed. Ford Motor Company retooled entire assembly lines to produce Studebaker trucks specifically designed for Soviet requirements. Vehicles that could navigate Russian roads, operate in extreme cold, and carry the supplies that would keep resistance alive. General Motors converted tank production facilities to manufacture the engines and transmissions that would power Allied victory. Chrysler's factories worked around the clock, their assembly lines illuminated by searchlights as shifts rotated continuously. Liberty ships represented the most visible symbol of American industrial determination. These vessels, designed for rapid construction rather than elegance, embodied democracy's approach to warfare. Overwhelming quantity rather than individual perfection. Shipyards in Baltimore, San Francisco, and Portland launched new vessels faster than German U-boats could sink them. Each ship carried 10,000 tons of cargo, enough to feed a small city for weeks or equip an entire division with vehicles and weapons. Hopkins signed the dispatch orders with hands that trembled from caffeine and urgency rather than age. Every signature represented lives saved. Every shipment carried hope across 5,000 miles of submarine-infested ocean. The Arctic convoy routes to Murmansk and Archangel had become lifelines connecting American abundance with Soviet desperation. The first convoy of 1942 departed. Norfolk carrying 15,000 tons of wheat flour, 8,000 tons of canned meat, and 200 Studebaker trucks. These supplies would navigate the treacherous passage past German naval bases in Norway, survive Luftwaffe attacks above the Arctic Circle, and ultimately reach the frozen docks of Murmansk. From there, Soviet rail networks would carry American aid to the besieged populations fighting for survival against calculated starvation. As Hopkins watched another convoy disappear into the gray Atlantic mist, he understood that America had entered a race against time and hunger. German artillery might pound Leningrad's buildings, but American factories were producing the means of survival faster than Nazi strategy could destroy it. The siege would test whether democratic productivity could overcome totalitarian patience. January 1942 brought temperatures that turned breath into ice crystals and made survival a daily negotiation with death. Anna Zhdanova stood in the bread line at dawn, her position, number 847, scratched onto a piece of cardboard that had become more valuable than rubles. The bakery ovens glowed faintly through frosted windows, producing loaves that contained more sawdust and cellulose than wheat flour. Bread rations had fallen to 125 grams per day for workers, barely enough to fill a child's cupped hands. For dependents, elderly, and children, the ration was 75 grams, a portion smaller than a modern dinner roll. The dark, dense loaves felt heavy as stones and tasted of wood shavings and desperation. Families divided these meager portions with surgical precision, weighing each crumb on makeshift scales constructed from coat hangers and buttons. Anna's diary recorded the arithmetic of starvation, day 127 of siege. Pavel weighs perhaps 30 kilograms now, down from 45 in September. His ribs show through his shirt, like piano keys. Today he asked if we could boil his shoes for soup. I measured our remaining wallpaper glue, perhaps enough for 3 more meals if we mix it with water and sawdust. The death toll climbed with mathematical precision. October had claimed 4,000 civilians daily. November saw 9,000 deaths each day. By January, over 100,000 Leningraders had died from starvation, disease, and cold. Bodies accumulated in apartments where surviving family members lacked the strength to carry them downstairs. City officials distributed sledges to help families transport. Their dead-to-collection points were frozen. Corpses were stacked like cordwood. Children stopped attending. School not from choice, but from physical inability. Anna's classroom, which had housed 35 students in September, now contained fewer than 12 regular attendees. Those who came sat wrapped in blankets, their lessons interrupted by fainting spells and the constant gnawing of hunger that made concentration impossible. She taught multiplication tables to children who calculated the caloric content of pencil erasers and wondered if textbook paste was edible. Families consumed everything remotely digestible. Leather belts were boiled for hours until they produced a thin, protein-rich broth. Wallpaper paste made from flour and animal glue became a delicacy when mixed with water and heated. Shoes were dismantled for their inner soles, which could be softened and chewed. Pet cats and dogs disappeared first, followed by zoo animals as desperate citizens sought any source of protein. Yet Leningrad endured. Soviet General Andrei Zhdanov, the city's political chief, reported daily to Moscow with grim determination, "We are alive, but at a terrible cost. Every sunrise claims another 1,000 lives, but the city does not surrender. Our people prefer death to Nazi occupation." His reports emphasized not just suffering, but resistance, a population that chose starvation over submission. Anna's family gathered around their diminishing fire each evening, burning furniture legs and picture frames to maintain a few degrees of warmth. Her children no longer played games, but instead discussed which household items might be edible. The siege had transformed childhood innocence into premature expertise in survival's harsh mathematics. Outside, German artillery continued its methodical bombardment, each shell representing von Lieb's confidence that hunger would accomplish what high explosives could not. But across the frozen expanse of Lake Ladoga, Soviet engineers were beginning to construct something unprecedented, a supply route that would challenge the Wehrmacht's certainty that Leningrad was doomed to starve. German soldiers huddled in trenches that offered little protection from either Soviet shells or the merciless Baltic winter. Their breath froze into icicles that hung from wool scarves wrapped around faces already marked by frostbite and malnutrition. The irony was bitter. An army besieging a starving city while suffering from its own supply shortages and inadequate winter equipment. Field. Marshal von Lieb studied reports that painted an increasingly troubling picture of Wehrmacht logistics. Army Group North had been stripped of 2 panzer divisions to reinforce the drive on Moscow, leaving his forces vulnerable to Soviet counterattacks. Fuel allocations had been reduced by 60%, forcing commanders to choose between heating their headquarters and operating their vehicles. Artillery ammunition was rationed to 30 rounds per gun per day, barely enough to maintain psychological pressure on Leningrad's defenders. The German soldiers implementing the siege strategy understood its harsh mathematics even as they endured its consequences. Private Klaus Weber wrote to his wife in Bavaria, "We watch the Russian city starve, while we ourselves eat horse meat and black bread that tastes like sawdust. The cold penetrates our uniforms as if we were naked. Some men have lost fingers and toes to frostbite, yet still we maintain the blockade." Wehrmacht supply convoys struggled through partisan-infested forests and snow-choked roads that claimed vehicles and lives with mechanical indifference. German logistics officers calculated that each truck delivering supplies to the Leningrad front consumed more fuel than it transported, creating a death spiral of diminishing returns. The siege that was supposed to conserve German resources was instead consuming them at an unsustainable rate. Von Lieb's headquarters received daily intelligence reports describing conditions inside. Leningrad civilian deaths mounting, food riots, families burning furniture for warmth. Yet the city's defensive positions remained manned. Soviet artillery continued to fire, and reconnaissance flights revealed ongoing activity in factories that should have been abandoned. The mathematics of starvation were proving less reliable than German strategists had assumed. The contrast between expectation and reality became stark when German patrols discovered abandoned Soviet positions littered with American-made equipment. Studebaker trucks, manufactured in Detroit and shipped via Arctic convoys, bore U.S. Army serial numbers and English-language maintenance instructions. Canned meat with labels from Chicago stockyards provided evidence that supplies were reaching the besieged population. Despite the supposedly impenetrable blockade, German intelligence officers examined these artifacts with growing concern. Each American truck represented industrial capacity that exceeded Wehrmacht production. Each can of Spam symbolized agricultural abundance that Germany could not match. The discovery of U.S.-made winter clothing, boots, and medical supplies suggested a supply network that operated beyond German interdiction. Capabilities. Von Lieb's confidence began to waver as reports accumulated of Soviet forces receiving reinforcements and supplies despite the siege's apparent completeness. His artillery officers complained that Soviet counter-battery fire had increased rather than decreased, suggesting adequate ammunition reserves. Reconnaissance flights revealed truck convoys moving across Lake Ladoga's frozen surface, impossible according to German calculations, but undeniably real. The siege was failing not because German forces lacked determination, but because they faced an enemy supported by industrial capacity that transcended European limitations. While Wehrmacht quartermasters rationed bullets and boots, Soviet forces received American aid that rendered German scarcity calculations obsolete. The very strategy designed to conserve German resources was proving more expensive than the frontal assault von Lieb had sought to avoid. Lake Ladoga stretched like a frozen highway into the Arctic darkness, its surface thick enough to support convoys of trucks carrying hope into a starving city. Soviet engineers had achieved the impossible, transforming a frozen lake into a supply route that German intelligence had dismissed as fantasy. The road of life became Leningrad's lifeline and democracy's answer to Nazi starvation strategy. Studebaker trucks led the convoys, their American-built engines designed for reliability rather than elegance. These vehicles, manufactured in South Bend, Indiana, and shipped via Murmansk, represented the marriage of Soviet desperation and American industrial capacity. Each truck carried 2 tons of flour, sugar, and canned meat, enough to feed 200 families for a week or to keep resistance alive for another day. The journey across Lake Ladoga tested human endurance and mechanical reliability under conditions that exceeded all design specifications. Temperatures dropped to 40 degrees below zero, turning steel brittle and rubber hard as concrete. German artillery targeted the ice road with mathematical precision, creating craters that forced convoys to navigate increasingly dangerous routes. Luftwaffe bombers attacked the slow-moving trucks with impunity, their pilots able to see the vehicle headlights from 50 miles away. Soviet drivers, many of them women recruited from collective farms, navigated by compass and prayer through blizzards that reduced visibility to arm's length. They drove with windows open despite the cold because frosted glass made navigation impossible. Frostbite claimed fingers and toes, but the convoys continued. Each successful delivery meant families would eat for another day, children would attend school for another week, and resistance would continue for another month. General Andrei Zhdanov supervised every delivery with obsessive attention to detail. His headquarters maintained precise records of tonnage delivered, calories distributed, and lives saved. By February 1942, the Road of Life had transported 46,000 tons of food into Leningrad, far short of the city's needs but sufficient to maintain minimal subsistence. For the surviving population, the impact was measurable in statistics that revealed both triumph and tragedy. Civilian deaths slowed from 9,000 daily to 3,000 daily, still catastrophic, but representing 6,000 lives saved each day. Schools reopened with skeleton classes. Factories resumed limited production. The city's heartbeat nearly stopped, began again with faint but steady rhythm. American vehicles proved superior to Soviet trucks in the extreme conditions. Studebaker engines started reliably in temperatures that froze domestic models solid. U.S.-made tires retained flexibility when Soviet rubber became brittle as glass. Maintenance manuals written in English were translated into Russian and distributed to mechanics who learned to service American equipment with tools improvised from battlefield scrap. Or Anna Jordanova received her first substantial meal in months when trucks delivered wheat, flour that produced bread containing actual grain rather than sawdust and cellulose. Her diary recorded, "Today, Pavel smiled for the first time since October. The bread tastes like bread, not wood shavings. Perhaps we will survive to see spring." The road of life represented more than logistics. It symbolized the collision between totalitarian calculation and democratic determination. German strategy had assumed that isolated populations would surrender when starvation became unbearable. But the ice road proved that no population was truly isolated when supported by allies. Possessing unlimited industrial capacity and unwavering commitment to their survival, Detroit assembly lines hummed with mechanical precision that transformed raw steel into instruments of liberation. The River Rouge plant, Ford's industrial cathedral, operated around the clock as shifts rotated continuously under searchlights that turned night into perpetual day. Studebaker trucks rolled off conveyors every 14 minutes, their chassis destined for Arctic convoys that would carry American abundance to Soviet desperation. Harry Hopkins toured factories that had redefined the meaning of mass production. Assembly lines that had manufactured civilian automobiles now produced military vehicles with efficiency that staggered foreign observers. American workers, many of them women recruited to replace men serving overseas, demonstrated industrial prowess that exceeded theoretical limits. The United States was producing trucks faster than Germany could manufacture artillery shells to destroy them. The numbers told a story of overwhelming industrial superiority. By war's end, American factories would deliver 400,000 trucks to the Soviet Union, more vehicles than the Wehrmacht possessed at the invasion's peak. U.S. aircraft production reached 96,000 planes annually, exceeding German output by a factor of 4. Tank production climbed to 29,000 vehicles yearly, while German factories struggled to produce 9,000 tanks in the same period. Liberty ships represented the most visible symbol of American industrial determination. These vessels, designed for rapid construction rather than maritime elegance, embodied democracy's approach to warfare through overwhelming quantity. Shipyards in 18 states launched new vessels faster than German submarines could sink them. Average construction time dropped from 244 days to 42 days as workers perfected techniques that treated shipbuilding like automobile assembly. The E.E. Richmond Shipyard in California achieved the impossible by launching a Liberty ship in 4 days and 15 hours, faster than most vessels required for sea trials. Henry Kaiser's shipyards employed prefabrication techniques that revolutionized naval construction. Entire hull sections were assembled inland and transported to docks, where cranes lowered them into position like massive building. Block's American agricultural abundance supplemented industrial output with food supplies that exceeded military requirements. Farmers produced surplus wheat, corn, and livestock that could feed both domestic populations and Allied forces without rationing. The contrast with European scarcity was stark, while German civilians consumed ersatz coffee and sawdust bread. American families maintained peacetime nutrition standards while supporting global relief efforts. Lend-Lease shipments included items that revealed American prosperity's depth. Canned meat from Chicago stockyards, wheat flour from Kansas mills, and sugar from Louisiana refineries crossed oceans to reach battlefields where such abundance seemed impossible. Soviet soldiers received chocolate bars, chewing gum, and cigarettes, luxuries that demonstrated America's capacity to export comfort along with necessity. Factory workers understood their role in a global struggle between abundance and scarcity. Rosie the Riveter became more than propaganda. She represented industrial democracy's human face. Women who had never seen assembly lines mastered complex manufacturing processes with determination that matched any battlefield courage. Their productivity statistics became weapons as potent as bullets and bombs. The arsenal of democracy operated with efficiency that transformed American society while equipping Allied victory. Cities like Detroit, Pittsburgh, and Los Angeles became centers of global liberation through industrial output that rendered enemy calculations obsolete. Every vehicle that rolled off assembly lines carried the promise that democratic values, properly equipped, could overcome any tyranny through superior production rather than superior sacrifice. German supply depots resembled archaeological sites where scarcity had been systematically catalogued and rationed. Officers distributed ammunition by counting individual bullets, fuel by measuring cup rather than gallon, and food by weight rather than abundance. The Wehrmacht, once confident in its tactical superiority, now discovered that wars were won not just by strategy but by logistics that sustained fighting capability over extended campaigns. Army Group North's supply situation had deteriorated beyond Field Marshal von Lieb's worst projections. Panzer divisions stripped from his command to reinforce Moscow and Stalingrad left him with infantry units lacking mobile striking power. Fuel allocations dropped by 70% as German refineries struggled to meet competing demands from multiple fronts. Artillery ammunition was rationed to 20 rounds per gun per day, barely sufficient for harassing fire, inadequate for serious bombardment. German soldiers witnessed the harsh mathematics of scarcity in their daily equipment. Winter uniforms designed for Central European climates proved inadequate for Russian cold that penetrated wool and leather like water through fabric. Boots disintegrated after weeks of exposure to temperatures that turned rubber brittle and leather rigid. Weapons required constant maintenance as lubricants. Frozen metal components contracted beyond tolerance specifications. The contrast with Soviet equipment became undeniable when German patrols captured American-made supplies. Studebaker trucks operated reliably in temperatures that immobilized German vehicles. U.S.-manufactured winter clothing provided warmth that Wehrmacht uniforms could not match. American boots remained flexible and waterproof under conditions that destroyed German footwear within days. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Private Weber wrote to his family, "We discovered a Soviet supply dump containing enough American trucks to equip an entire division. The engines start instantly in cold that freezes our vehicles solid. Their soldiers wear boots that must cost more than our monthly pay. We are fighting not just Russians, but American factories that produce faster than we can destroy." German intelligence officers studied, captured American equipment with professional admiration and strategic concern. Each item revealed industrial capacity that exceeded European manufacturing. Canned meat bore labels from companies that produced more food in a single day than German agriculture could generate in weeks. Vehicles carried identification plates from factories that manufactured more trucks, monthly than Germany produced annually. Wehrmacht quartermasters calculated that individual American soldiers received equipment worth more than entire German companies possessed. A single U.S. Army truck contained more steel than German factories allocated to entire infantry battalions. American soldiers discarded items that German troops would treasure: cigarettes, chocolate, medical supplies that represented luxuries beyond Wehrmacht imagination. Tank production statistics told the story of industrial disparity in numbers that rendered tactical excellence irrelevant. German factories struggled to replace combat losses, while American assembly lines produced surplus vehicles for Allied distribution. By 1943, U.S. tank production exceeded German output by 3-1, creating numerical superiority that overwhelmed tactical advantages. The siege of Leningrad had consumed German resources at rates that exceeded strategic projections. Artillery shells fired at the city cost more than the food supplies they prevented from entering. Fuel consumed maintaining the blockade exceeded the petroleum saved by reducing Leningrad's industrial capacity. Von Lieb's efficient strategy had become an expensive drain on resources that Germany could not afford to lose. Hitler's attention turned south toward Stalingrad, while Leningrad continued to resist with stubborn determination that tide down 30 German divisions desperately needed elsewhere. The strategic miscalculation was becoming apparent. Resources committed to starving one city could have equipped entire army groups for offensive operations. Soviet forces, strengthened by American supplies, demonstrated resilience that German planners had not anticipated. Field Marshal von Lieb submitted his resignation in frustration at impossible strategic requirements. Hitler demanded Leningrad's capture while simultaneously withdrawing the forces necessary to achieve that objective. The Wehrmacht faced the classic dilemma of overextension, too many objectives with insufficient resources to accomplish any of them. Decisively, Soviet morale improved as American aid became visible in frontline units. 17% of Soviet vehicles were now U.S. manufactured, providing mobility that enabled rapid redeployment and supply operations. American trucks carried Soviet artillery pieces to firing positions, transported ammunition to forward units, and evacuated wounded soldiers to medical facilities equipped with U.S.-supplied surgical instruments and medicines. General Zhdanov reported to Stalin with cautious optimism, "The city endures. American supplies have stabilized our situation. Each convoy across Lake Ladoga brings not just food, but proof that we are not alone. Our soldiers see American equipment and understand that the world's most powerful democracy supports our struggle." Anna Zhdanova watched convoys of American trucks rolling through Leningrad's streets, their cargo bays filled with supplies that represented survival for another week. Her diary recorded, "Pavel gained weight this month for the first time since September. He asked today if Americans are giants because their trucks are so large. I told him Americans are people like us who understand that freedom must be defended everywhere, or it exists nowhere." The mathematics of siege warfare had shifted fundamentally. German artillery consumed scarce ammunition, firing at a city that received daily reinforcement via routes that Wehrmacht interdiction could not close. Soviet forces absorbed casualties and replaced them with troops equipped by American industry. The siege that was supposed to conserve German resources was consuming them faster than frontal assault would have required. Intelligence reports revealed the scope of American industrial support. Liberty ships delivered 1,000 tons of supplies daily to Soviet ports despite German submarine warfare. U.S. factories produced more military equipment in a single month than Germany, manufactured in 3 months. American agricultural surplus could feed Soviet armies while maintaining domestic abundance that supported continued war production. Stalin's forces launched limited offensives around Leningrad, probing German lines with attacks supported by American artillery and transported by U.S. trucks. These operations demonstrated that the besieged had become besiegers, with Soviet units possessing mobility and firepower that challenged German defensive positions. The strategic impact extended beyond Leningrad's immediate vicinity. 30 German divisions committed to the siege could not participate in the drive toward Stalingrad, where Wehrmacht forces would face even more desperate fighting. Hitler's decision to maintain the blockade while pursuing southern objectives created resource competition. That weakened both efforts. Anna heard radio, reports of Soviet victories far to the south, and whispered to her children, "Perhaps we will live to see victory. Perhaps this suffering will end with triumph rather than defeat." The siege that had begun as German strategy was becoming Soviet opportunity, a demonstration that defensive warfare, properly supported, could exhaust attackers more effectively than any offensive operation. Warehouses in Murmansk overflowed with American abundance that transformed Soviet resistance from desperate endurance into sustainable warfare. Canned meat from Chicago stockyards, wheat flour from Kansas mills, and sugar from Louisiana refineries arrived by Liberty ships that survived Arctic convoys to deliver hope, measured in tons rather than grams. The United States had become Leningrad's lifeline through industrial capacity that rendered German starvation strategy obsolete. Soviet distribution networks, strengthened by American trucks and organizational efficiency, delivered supplies with precision that supported both military operations and civilian survival. By 1943, U.S. food shipments provided 4.5 million tons of nutrition to Soviet forces, equivalent to half a pound per soldier per day. This abundance allowed Soviet commanders to maintain fighting strength while supporting besieged populations that had become symbols of resistance. General. Zhdanov supervised food distribution with mathematical precision that transformed starvation into subsistence, and subsistence into strength. American Spam became a delicacy in Leningrad restaurants that reopened as supply convoys restored minimal normalcy. Families that had boiled leather belts for protein now received canned meat that provided complete nutrition. Children who had collapsed from hunger now attended schools that served meals prepared from American wheat. The psychological impact equaled the nutritional benefits. Soviet soldiers understood that the world's most powerful democracy supported their struggle with material aid that demonstrated American commitment to Allied victory. Each American truck carried not just supplies, but proof that democratic values transcended national boundaries. Every can of U.S. manufactured food represented industrial capacity dedicated to defeating tyranny through abundance rather than scarcity. American agricultural statistics revealed the depth of democratic abundance. U.S. farmers produced surplus food that could feed both domestic populations and Allied forces without rationing that compromised civilian nutrition. While German families consumed ersatz coffee and sawdust bread, American households maintained peacetime dietary standards while supporting global relief efforts that sustained resistance. Across multiple continents, Anna Zhdanova tasted Spam for the first time in February 1943, her diary recording, "This canned meat is richer than anything we ate before the war." Pavel asked if all Americans eat such food regularly. I told him that in democratic countries, abundance is normal rather than exceptional. Perhaps that is why they can share their prosperity with strangers fighting for freedom. The contrast between American abundance and German scarcity became stark as intelligence reports revealed Wehrmacht supply problems. German soldiers received 200 grams of black bread daily while Soviet forces consumed American rations that provided complete nutrition plus luxuries like chocolate and cigarettes. U.S. industrial capacity produced surplus equipment that could be distributed to allies, while German factories struggled to meet basic military requirements. Liberty ships continued their Arctic voyages despite German submarine warfare that claimed vessels and lives but could not interrupt the flow of supplies that sustained resistance. American shipyards launched vessels faster than German U-boats could sink them, creating industrial momentum that overwhelmed enemy interdiction efforts through superior production rather than superior seamanship. The siege of Leningrad had become a laboratory, demonstrating democracy's capacity to support distant allies. Through industrial abundance, American factories produced the means of survival, while Soviet citizens provided the courage to employ those means against calculated starvation. Together, they created a partnership that proved democratic values could overcome totalitarian strategy through superior logistics rather than superior sacrifice. January 1943 brought the thunder of 2,000 Soviet artillery pieces, unleashing Operation Iskra, the offensive that would crack the German stranglehold. On Leningrad, after 822 days of siege, American trucks transported Soviet ammunition to firing positions. U.S. manufactured shells screamed across frozen battlefields, and democratic industrial might finally challenged Nazi patience with overwhelming firepower that announced the siege's approaching end. Soviet forces, strengthened by months of American supplies, demonstrated combat effectiveness that surprised German defenders who had grown accustomed to facing starving opponents. Troops equipped with U.S. winter clothing, boots, and weapons attacked with energy that well-fed soldiers could sustain, but undernourished defenders could not match. The mathematics of siege warfare had reversed. Besiegers were now weaker than the besieged. General Leonid Govorov directed the offensive with precision that reflected both Soviet tactical skill and American logistical support. His artillery preparation consumed 300,000 shells, more ammunition than Army Group North possessed in total reserves. American trucks moved assault troops to jumping-off positions, U.S. manufactured medical supplies equipped field hospitals, and democratic abundance sustained operations that Wehrmacht scarcity could not counter. The breakthrough came at Schlesselburg, where Soviet infantry crossed the frozen Neva River under covering fire from artillery pieces transported by American vehicles. German positions, weakened by months of inadequate supplies and reinforcement, collapsed under attacks supported by industrial capacity that exceeded European limitations. The narrow land corridor opened by Operation Iskra measured only 8 miles wide but represented unlimited connection to Soviet interior and American aid. First, trains rolled into Leningrad through the corridor while German artillery continued firing at tracks that Soviet engineers repaired faster than Wehrmacht bombardment could destroy them. American rails, spikes, and locomotives ensured that supply lines remained operational despite enemy interdiction efforts. The train whistle that announced Leningrad's reconnection to the motherland carried the sound of democratic victory over totalitarian calculation. Civilian reaction to the breakthrough reflected both relief and determination that had sustained resistance through the darkest months. Anna Zdanova wrote in her diary, "The trains are running again." Pavel heard the whistle and cried, not from sadness, but from joy that we are no longer alone. The Americans fed us when we were starving, and now their supplies will help us survive whatever comes next. Germany. Forces struggled to contain the offensive with resources, depleted by months of siege warfare that had consumed more supplies than it prevented from entering the city. Wehrmacht ammunition shortages forced artillery units to ration shells, while Soviet guns fired continuously with American-supplied rounds. The strategic calculus had shifted. Fundamentally, defenders were now attacking while attackers could only defend. The land corridor enabled massive supply deliveries that transformed Leningrad from a starving city into a viable military base. American trucks could now drive directly into the city rather than navigating the dangerous ice road across Lake Ladoga. Tonnage deliveries increased tenfold as rail transport replaced truck convoys, bringing abundance that supported both civilian recovery and military operations. The siege's breaking demonstrated democracy's capacity to sustain distant allies through industrial abundance that overwhelmed enemy calculations. American factories had produced the means of victory, while Soviet citizens provided the courage to achieve it. Together, they created a partnership that proved democratic values could triumph through superior logistics, superior production, and superior determination to defend freedom wherever tyranny threatened. The final accounting of Lend-Lease aid to the Soviet Union revealed numbers that staggered comprehension and redefined understanding of industrial warfare. American factories delivered 17.5 million tons of supplies to Soviet forces, enough cargo to fill 350,000 railroad cars or provide every Soviet soldier with 2 tons of equipment and supplies. Democracy had armed resistance through abundance that rendered totalitarian strategy obsolete. Harry Hopkins reviewed the statistics with satisfaction that reflected both personal achievement and national vindication. American trucks numbered 400,000 vehicles delivered to Soviet forces, more transportation than the Wehrmacht possessed at its peak. Strength. U.S. aircraft deliveries totaled 14,000 planes, providing air power that supported ground operations and maintained supply routes despite German interdiction efforts. Tank deliveries reached 13,000 vehicles, each one representing industrial capacity that exceeded enemy production. The human cost of Leningrad's resistance defied calculation while demanding perpetual remembrance. Over 1 million civilians died during the 872-day siege, men, women, and children who chose starvation over surrender, death over submission to tyranny. Their sacrifice purchased time that allowed American industry to mobilize, Soviet forces to regroup, and democratic values to triumph through superior production rather than superior suffering. Anna Zdanova survived to see victory. Her diary preserved as testimony to human endurance supported by industrial abundance. She wrote in her final entry, "We ate sawdust bread and boiled our shoes, but we never ate our principles. American trucks brought us food when we were starving, proof when we were despairing, and hope when hope seemed impossible." Pavel is now strong enough to play again. Perhaps that is what victory means. Children who can afford to waste energy on joy field. Marshal von Lieb's strategy had failed not because German forces lacked determination, but because totalitarian calculation could not compete with democratic production. The siege that was designed to conserve Wehrmacht resources consumed them faster than frontal assault would have required. 30 German divisions tied down around Leningrad could not participate in other operations where their absence contributed to defeats at Stalingrad, Kursk, and ultimately Berlin. The strategic impact extended far beyond Leningrad's immediate survival. The city's resistance demonstrated that no population was truly isolated when supported by allies possessing unlimited industrial capacity and unwavering commitment to democratic values. American abundance had transformed siege warfare from a battle of endurance into a contest of production, a contest that totalitarian regimes could not win against. Democratic industrial might, Soviet forces emerged from the Yar siege with combat experience, American equipment, and confidence that would carry them to Berlin. The city that had nearly starved became a symbol of resistance that inspired liberation movements across occupied Europe. Leningrad's survival proved that democratic values, properly supported, could overcome any tyranny. Through superior logistics, rather than superior sacrifice, the arsenal of democracy had demonstrated its power not through dramatic battles, but through sustained production that supported distant allies during their darkest hours. American factories produced victory one truck, one can of food, one Liberty ship at a time. The siege of Leningrad ended because America could build faster than tyranny could destroy, and democracy's factories became as lethal as any weapon in freedom's arsenal. If you enjoyed the story I hand-picked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.